this initiative. So with that, by way of introduction and thanks, I would like to introduce our really keynote speaker today, Dr. Arati Prabhakar. You'll tell me how to pronounce that better when you join us. And really, truly honored to have her with us today. She's the director of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, and she has spent her career focusing on the development of new technologies and businesses. We thought a day focusing on data governance and policy had to start with really a deep engagement around where the technology itself is going, and she will offer us important perspectives on that. In addition to her early career at DARPA, President Clinton appointed her in 1993 to lead the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. She also spent time in Silicon Valley as a chief technology officer at Raychem, president of Interval Research, and then a partner at Venture Partners. She serves on numerous boards and committees, has a PhD in applied physics from the California Institute, and we're delighted to have her with us. Joining us in this discussion is our own Columbia University SIPA professor, Ken Prewitt, Carnegie Professor of Public Affairs and a special advisor to President Bollinger of Columbia University. He was a critical person in also bringing our Columbia Global Centers into existence and continues to play a lead role there. Former director of the U.S. Census Bureau. So I thank you all very much for joining, and if I could invite our distinguished speaker and Ken Prewitt to join.
Great.
Well, thank you so much for being with us. I think, we can't have this conversation without first just inviting you to share your perspectives on where you think the technological changes are occurring that are the most data-focused and touch your world and that you're driving. I think as everyone should know, DARPA spends about $3 billion a year in fostering innovation and research in areas of security importance. And data analytics, I think, is an increasingly important part of what you do.
Absolutely. It's woven into so much of what we're doing. First, let me just say thanks for the chance to do this. When I got the invitation from Dean Janow, I looked at what you all were going to focus on today, and I just thought it was a terrific opportunity. I love the fact that you've got people from all these different perspectives, because we all know that when we're involved with a very powerful technology as data and data analytics are today, the history of humankind says that these technologies are going to be used for good and for ill, and the choices that we make about how we grapple with those challenges, I think, are so key to getting good outcomes. So I really welcome the chance to have the conversation. Maybe just to open up, when I think about what's happening in this field, I see enormous possibilities, and given DARPA's mission of breakthrough technologies for national security, that's obviously something that we are pursuing with great vigor, and I'll tell you a few things about that. But of course, in doing that work, it becomes very, very clear what some of the challenges are, what some of the limitations are, and what some of the kinds of choices are that we're going to have to make going forward. So I'll maybe just say a couple of words about that. Possibilities. I think it's easy to see the boundlessness of possibilities, even in our consumer lives in the commercial world. You go on Facebook, you see photos that have been identified by machine learning techniques. You do a search for something obscure and you think, I wonder if it'll work, and before you know it, it auto-completes and gives you the thing you want. The amount of financial trading that's now being done algorithmically is continuing to grow very, very rapidly. So I think it's already part of the lives that we're living. Looking one step beyond that, there's some things coming down the pike that I think will expand the footprint of these kinds of technologies in some important ways. And some of them are outside of the information realm per se. For example, a decade ago, DARPA had a couple of challenges to the DARPA Grand Challenge and then the Urban Challenge. These were challenges to the community to build a self-driving vehicle. And no one completed the first one. A year later, there were actually some people who were able to complete the course. If you want to find the people who came in first, second, and third, you will find many of them at places like Google today, and that really sparked the self-driving car movement, which, if you think about it, that is an example of an area where data and data analytics are integral to being able to accomplish that new capability. That's happening in the private sector today. At DARPA a couple of weeks ago, we just christened our self-driving ship, and this is a vessel that'll be able to navigate away from the pier and travel for thousands of miles across the open seas, building on many of the same ideas and technologies to be able to do things like follow the rules of the open seas and avoid collision. So something that's not just in the information realm, but is critically dependent on the kind of data that is becoming omnipresent. I think we all see it in medicine. We see it in other areas. Think about consumer behavior and how core it has become to understanding online consumer behavior and the marketing value of that. Of course, the flip side in the security world is we're starting now to be able to develop techniques to understand the influence of online propaganda, and that's becoming core to the security enterprise. I think the list is very long. There are a few areas where we are using the tools of data, big data and data analytics that I think don't really yet have a big parallel in the commercial world, and I'll just mention those briefly. One is in cybersecurity. We're going to talk about that as one of the problems to wrestle with, but it's also a place where data analytics is starting to be a very valuable tool to try to scale solutions faster than the threat is growing. And then in yet another area, one of the areas where we're applying the techniques of machine learning and this new wave of statistical learning that's happening in artificial intelligence today is in understanding what's happening in the radio spectrum. Our first work in this area is about building systems that allow our fighter aircraft to recognize a new radar signal and adaptively jam and protect themselves. But that same kind of radio system with built-in artificial intelligence to dynamically understand what's happening in a spectral band, those we believe will be the core capabilities that allow us to get much more spectrum utilization and accommodate this explosion of bandwidth that we need. So again, data showing up as core to an area that I think is a little bit outside the ones and zeros that we usually think about. So I think with that, a long list of challenges and choices. Many of them I think we're going to talk about today. Cybersecurity, so that you trust, can you trust the ones and zeros that you're relying on? Once you trust the ones and zeros, can you actually trust the information? What is the quality of the data? Where did it come from? What's its provenance? How will it be? Can I trace back and find the data upon which important results are based? Almost immediately when you start talking about data, questions of privacy arise in one instance after another, or maybe broadening the issue from privacy to the issue of agency over data. Whoever owns or originates the data, how do they continue to have appropriate agency over that data? Big questions. Much of the richness of data today is our ability to use the techniques of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And coming back to image recognition, that's a great example of an area where machines now can be trained to identify images, and on a statistical basis, they now are at or starting now to exceed the human quality of image identification. That's really powerful to think about, and of course there are amazing applications. But here's the rub. Statistical learning systems, while they might, as they become better than humans on a statistical basis, they're still not perfect. And when they're wrong, they make mistakes that no human would ever make. And so how we choose, again, a major question about a challenge and the choices that we're going to have to make about where we use those systems and how we learn and the degree to which we want to trust them. Ken and I have spent a lot of time talking about big data and correlation versus causation. Some of my Silicon Valley friends like to say big data is great, more data is always better. And I say to them, well, I'm not sure about that, because if you have more data, sometimes it just means that you can find some data to support your hypothesis, and it doesn't actually prove that it's right, because correlation is not causation. But I think really understanding what we do and don't know when we start seeing sometimes spurious correlations is going to be very, very critical. Maybe I'll just finish my list of things to ponder for the future by sharing something that I think is core to our business of national security. We all live in a data-rich economy, in a data-rich society. But of course, today only about half of the people on the planet have access to the internet. And I think a very interesting question, and a core one for from a future security lens, is the question of the kind of access that the second half of the globe will get in the years to come. Will it look like the access in China and Iran? Will it be mediated through a company that provides it? Will it look like the relatively open access that we enjoy here, which, by the way, is not fully open, because, of course, that too is mediated through the lens of business and advertising and the commercial interests that are behind this implicit partnership that we have every time we go into the online environment. So I think there's plenty to think about. I think it's important to think deeply about these issues, but the gold rush of activity, because of commercial market opportunities, because of national security needs, the pressure to deal with these issues, I think, is very, very significant. And I think we all sense the urgency behind the core policy questions that are being raised because of the amount of activity that's going on here. So I'll just stop with that.
Well, thank you very much. It's a wonderful start. And I'd like to get back later to the last point about access, because that's really an internet governance question. But before we do that, let me ask you just one more question. As you look at now all these potential use cases, you've mentioned a few around machine learning and cybersecurity, a self-driving ship. Since there is much more investment in data and data analytics from the private sector, I think 2 to 1 at least, but you're trying to drive data for national security applications. How do you pick, and how are you sort of seeing where the big bets are, if there is such a thing, around data analytics?
Yeah. DARPA has a long history of investing both in radical new military systems and new military capabilities, but also in underlying core technologies. And so iconically, stealth and precision strike on the one hand, and the internet, AI, and material science on the other hand. And I see this next generation with data very much the same. We previously funded much of the very early research that sparked this current wave of data analytics and machine learning. Today, we want to harvest that for national security purposes, but we are also making the next round of basic research investments to push beyond some of these core technical limitations that I touched on. How DARPA decides what to do. We're a very small agency. We are only 200 government employees. Half of that group is 100 technical staff who rotate in for typically 3 to 5 years. They come, among other places, from places like Columbia. One of our great program managers is on leave from Columbia to come help us. And within this context of understanding what our mission is, that it is breakthrough technologies for national security, beyond that context, we really rely on our program managers to very bottoms up identify. They are looking for the places where an investment of 3 to 5 years, $30 to $100 million, let's say, over that period of time, could really drive a technology area forward in a dramatic way and take something that seems a little crazy today and turn it into something that could really become a new capability, technical or military capability. Mm-hmm. So it's a very bottoms-up process. And back to data, I'm actually, when I start looking at our portfolio of a couple hundred programs, it's actually hard to find one that isn't deeply data dependent today. I think that is the nature of where so many of the interesting opportunities are.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. Well, I think this question of that you alluded to of separating insight from stuff. I mean, this is not a new problem around data, but now the nature and the massive nature of data that is available is somehow changing how we engage data. And I think this is an area that Ken has thought a lot about. Would you care to offer
Thank
thoughts?
you. Yes. Your program is misleading. If you look at the first panel, it treats me as if I'm on a par with Arati. I'm not. She's our keynoter. It's a rare opportunity to have access to a person of this scope of knowledge. And I might say a really critical role. DARPA, I'm convinced, is the most important federal agency that we have. And I say that unblushingly, not because I'm a defense freak, but just because of the sheer accomplishments and achievements in its history, including the internet, of course, and so forth and so on, and email.
We'll try to live up to that.
Yeah, well, but it is this, turn very smart people loose and see what they come up with is a great model. I will, but I'm only here to try to pose some questions to our keynoter. But since it makes it sound like I'm a talker, I'll also make a very long question, at least my initial question. I want to walk you through the history of the social sciences fairly carefully and quickly. Get started in the 1880s. Not much happens for the first 50 or so years. I mean, stuff and get institutionalized and so forth. Then something big happens. That's the 1930s. That's sampling theory. It changed the game. Up until that moment, by the way, to go what you just said about more data is always better data, the assumption was if you went out and did some survey, the more respondents you had, the better were your data. And therefore, if you could talk to 37% instead of 31%, you would have more confidence in the result. That's, of course, false. Not unless you get up to sort of 98% could that be true, because you have no measure whatsoever of representation. So sampling theory is a profound transformation of the empirical sciences, period, but certainly the empirical social sciences. A next big thing that happens doesn't happen until really the 1970s, 80s, when in effect we first begin to make really very strong partnerships with the physical sciences, in human engineering, obviously in public health, the human dimensions of sustainable development, and that really enlarged the scope of responsibilities that we now attach to these sciences, the human sciences. And now as far as I'm concerned, we're now in the midst of this fourth one, which is the big data transformation. Now, let me go back to the 1930s and say a word or two about what happened because of sampling theory. It was, I use the word, it was theory rich and data poor. It costs something to go out and talk to people, even to mail them an envelope and get it back. So every time you went out and talked to somebody else, it cost you. Now the unit cost of the last person we interview now in any large survey is in the several thousands of dollars. So it's expensive. Therefore, you could only justify that cost if you brought theory to it. And the questionnaire was our theory. We control the content of the data by the way in which we constructed the kind of questions and whether we're going to oversample, not oversample, and so forth and so on. So we created a science that was rested on theory construction, not just on accumulating information about human behavior and so forth. And that perfected itself and got connected to better and better data analytics. The statistical capacity to extract complicated models from the survey data is enormous. The census is nothing but the sampling frame for all of that. The census data itself is not that important. It's really the surveys that are based on the sampling frame that the census gives us. So, three things about those data. They were theory-driven. They knew how to deal with the issue of representation, of could we explain the entire population? Could we talk to 1,400 people and predict the election outcome? The answer to that is yes. If it's binary result, yes, win, lose, and so forth. Only 14 or so hundred people, et cetera, et cetera. So we had data that we knew to be representative of the population we wanted to talk to. And third, we really went to work on quality issues. The number of papers that have been written since the 1930s up through to today at the American Statistical Association and Population Association, in the millions, teasing out more and more understandings of data quality, and item response and questionnaire wording and questionnaire ordering, the whole array of stuff, and people in this field know this. Okay, so we did quality, we did the idea of representation, and we did theory. Now, shift to these new data, and this is finally to my question.
I'm wanting to take notes. This is awesome.
In that process that I just quickly described, one of the most important things we did was the Academy formed a partnership with the government. That is, the interaction between academic social science and public health, in human science, human behavior, human dimensions of engineering, all those kinds. The interaction of that to the government was constant and intense. If you go to the meeting of the American Statistical Association or Public Population Association, what have you, every panel practically has got somebody from the federal statistical system, Bureau of Labor Statistics, Health Statistics, Census Bureau, of course, and so on. So a thick interaction. So we worked out the problems of creating a good science. At the same time, the government was working out its problems of how do you get quality data about your population. And, of course, it was in the public good. This was, after all, public information, transparently collected, made available to the public. And, by the way, we largely solved the privacy confidentiality issues. We have, I promise you, very, very workable rules about how we protect that, firewalls and so forth. When I went to the Census Bureau, the first thing I was told, which was fascinating, was how many hackers that we were paying to try to break into the census data. And so we could reverse engineering in terms of whatever they got. And they had a very hard time. We really have good firewalls. But that doesn't keep us from making the data available, and so we've created something called research data centers, which are enclaves, where very, very otherwise private data, the relationship of the IRS data to the Social Security data, to the BLS data, to the census data, and so forth, can all be put together by a scholar under certain rules and so forth and so on. So we've worked out a lot of the fundamental arrangements. Now, when you get to digital data, and I should include in that administrative data, which is also getting more digitized and therefore more available. That's Social Security data, our public health data, and so forth. A lot of that is coming out of administrative data, not out of the standard social media stuff. The data are data rich. Boy, there's a lot of items of observation. You can't even count them, and it gets bigger every day. As we sit here, it clicks through. And they're theory poor. They were not designed to test important ideas about our society at all. They're designed to market material, well, within the folds of Apple and Google and Facebook and so forth. They've got purposes. But, so the first thing is that we're now moving to a data set which was not driven by theory in the first place, but is driven just simply by the churning of nothing wrong with that. Lots of data points are very useful. Secondly, very little attention to quality. Good enough is good enough if you're in the commercial business. If you can sell your cars, that's good enough. If you can drive people to your site, that's good enough. The survey-based, census survey-based data stuff did not have a good enough mindset at all. You're supposed to count in the census 100% of the people in the right place on the right day. We actually don't do that, but we have very good models about how close we come and what it means that we don't come any closer and so forth. Good enough is good enough for a lot of purposes in the commercial sector. So quality is not primary. We certainly have the complicated privacy confidentiality issues, which we'll get back to, of course. But the big difference is it is not public sector data. It is not collected in service of the public good. It's collected, as we know, for commercial purposes. Great. There's absolutely no reason we don't want our commercial enterprises to be more innovative and more successful and so forth. That sets for me a huge challenge, and that's really, finally, to get to my question. How can we create the same kind of set of arrangements that over the last 40 or 50 years we perfected between the academic sciences and the government with the now third actor, which is the purveyor of data, is not the government. The purveyor of the data is the private sector, with its own reason for confidentiality and its own reason for non-transparency and its own reason certainly for intellectual property protections, its own reason for changing its algorithms without telling us. One small little footnote, I'm going on too long. The nice thing about survey data is we built, when I say theory, we also built trend lines into it. We ask the same question over and over and over. And so we have trend lines now that go back 30 or 40 years. And that really tells us enormous about the population. Google changes its algorithm 500 times a year. So that what you thought you had about a flu trend one day was not what you had about a flu trend a week later, because they changed the algorithm for their reasons, and they get to. But if they don't tell us the algorithm, we don't know exactly how they tweaked it, and therefore it's very difficult to build trend lines out of these data. That's enormous complications for using it for analytic and so forth purposes. So it seems to me one of the huge challenges is all the features about the data that we know need attention and so forth. And when I say this is the causation correlation issue, when I say theory-driven, I mean you've got models in your head before you go out and collect the data. And it's those models that give you the causal chains that lead to one thing or another, and so we can understand public health or understand violent behavior or whatever. So we have a big task, it seems to me, of reproducing what we have produced inside the survey census world with this new world. And finally, and you may have experience on this, so I'm going to add this as a footnote. A lot of, certainly the administrative data and the use of some of the digital data, even in government agencies, is not in their statistical programs. It's in their tech departments. The tech departments have a very different set of questions than the statistical agencies have. By the way, we have 16 statistical agencies, another 50 or 60 statistical programs, a huge array of expertise, which is expertise about survey data, not about digital data. And so building that expertise into those agencies and then making sure they have some responsibility and if not control as against the tech departments is a huge task for the government that it doesn't even understand that it has. Is that a clear enough question, all of that mess?
Well, I'm not going to answer all of that. I mean, I think maybe this group can start really tackling those questions. A couple of thoughts. I loved your historical perspective. And I think, to me, it's important to be clear that we're not going to substitute for these very rigorous, for example, the census process. I don't see that being chucked out the window and we're just going to rely on a bunch of commercial data. To me, the question is, what I see is a cornucopia of opportunity to use data collected through commercial means, data provided by consumers, or just not even people when they're consuming, just people putting their personal lives out into the public sphere, as well as new ways in which the government engages in both sharing government information, but also in the process of engaging with the citizenry, all of that data becomes. So I see it as a much wider set of data sources and opportunities, but all loaded with the kinds of questions that you're raising about what is it that we're actually measuring. And technology is certainly not going to solve all of those problems, but I think through a technology lens, it is helpful to look through that lens to understand what some of the limitations are. And maybe your comment about the era of the 30s being theory rich and data poor, that to me, that the statistical theory that underlies our capability to really know what we have from data, I count that in technology, and how that develops and how people who aren't steeped in it understand its limitations in the big data world, I think is going to be key. A couple of things that we are doing that I hope will contribute from a technology perspective, again, not a panacea. we have a program called Brandeis that is focused on building techniques to give the owners of data greater agency over their data. Not just, number one, so that they can understand the degree of sharing that they're doing, and they can choose to share, but under very specified, closed, bounded conditions. I mean, our thesis is that people very much want to control their data, but in fact that they would like to have their data shared, for example, for medical research or for public health. There are many other applications where, as long as you knew who was seeing your data, you knew how far it was going out in the world, and you knew for what period of time it was being made available, you'd probably choose to share it. Right now, that's done through user agreements that I can't find anyone. I don't know, we have lawyers in the room. Maybe the lawyers read those user agreements. I can't find anyone who reads those things. So that's clearly not going to be the way that it really works for people. But I think there's quite a lot that can be done from a technology perspective to make data agency a more tractable problem. It's not going to solve all of that, but I think more tools would be helpful. Your comment about correlation and causality was really interesting to me, because your statement was that we understood causality because we had a model. And one of the things that we're experimenting with today is the question of whether machines can help us build causal models from data. We started, our dream is that we could actually understand what Russia is doing in Europe by looking at all the vastness of the data that we have and building causal models under that. I think that may be a little while, but we started with what might be, we hope is a little bit more tractable problem. We're building systems that are ingesting huge volumes of literature on cancer pathways, and from that trying to build causal models that explain in these very complex systems, biological systems, what are actually the causal relationships. And some of the early results are pretty tantalizing, but I think part of what's happening is that we're looking at systems that are so vast and so complex that the causal model is no longer going to be contained in just one human brain at a time, and I think we're going to need machines even to help with that side of it.
Could I just underline one thing that made sure, something Arati just said, and it's not well understood, certainly even by the social scientists who think about these. We are having a huge problem right now in the survey world with response rates. They're just plummeting, and that's very costly, and that's even government surveys. And also item non-response, so that you'll answer the questionnaire, but you skip the ones you don't like and so forth. However, in this other world, people, and this is what you just hinted at, people seem eager to present themselves, and in a much, much richer way than, in effect, we're getting out of asking a few questions. So and that's obviously age-corrected. You get a ton of it down at the lower age levels and not so much of it at the higher age levels. And it's obviously geographically constricted, as you already mentioned. But the excitement of the intellectual excitement of having all of those data where people are kind of sharing a lot about themselves, if we can sort out the noise from what's really happening, is enormously powerful from a scientific point of view. So the fact that you're working on that, it seems to me, is a hugely important thing, and because the statistical agencies can't do that, they're just not ready to do that kind of work.
I know we want to open this up for the audience, so we have a lot of tremendous expertise in the room, but let me just ask one or two quick questions to throw a few more ideas out. You alluded to the fact that we're moving to a world of the Internet of Things, and I think, you'll have a unique perspective around that. I think we often focus in daily life on how we'll have a wallet embedded in our refrigerator, and it will tell us when our milk is depleted, and these kind of daily life things. But if you imagine a world where there is so much interconnection, then obviously the risk factor goes up enormously, and from a security perspective, you are thinking deeply about where the vulnerabilities are, how to protect against them, and you talk about a self-driving ship. Well, clearly that is crossing jurisdictions where where there are also different approaches to that information feeding back to the home jurisdiction. So how do you think about the risks, the management of risks, and the technology solutions that are around data for those risks?
The Internet of Things is something that is easy to get excited about, but until we wrangle security issues, I think I'm very concerned about the explosion in attack surface that we're building. And if you think about it, part of the challenge is the idea is that you're embedding connectivity into lots, you're moving it to the edge, so you're moving it into lots of small things. Well, small things don't really have the power, the size to put the kind of computational capability that's usually associated with having security. And so until we start building these things that are much more secure from the bottoms up, I think we are going to expand the attack surface very significantly. This is something that matters to the Defense Department as well. If you think about every military system that we build today, virtually everything we build has one or many processors in it. Embedded processing is just ubiquitous. And we think of our aircraft or our missiles as not being connected to the internet and therefore not that vulnerable. But of course they are, because if you think about the supply chain, if you think about how maintenance is done, the richness of connectivity is so great that virtually everything in some way ends up being connected, and once it's connected, it's also vulnerable. So these are, from some of our cybersecurity programs have actually been about this issue of how do you build provably secure embedded systems, both for DoD but also much more widely for the Internet of Things. And my hope is that we can start getting some of that technology out before the attack surface completely blossoms.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I know we don't have so much time, and I do want to open this up. Could I think we have a mic to pass around if someone would like to get us started. If not, I have a million other questions. Okay, I see one. Professor No.
I found this a really interesting discussion, very interesting. So let me kind of hypothesize into the future, but it's not very hypothetical. Data is becoming important, more and more gets collected, more and more gets collected by commercial companies. There are clear advantages of size and scale in this business. Large companies have more access to data, to transactions, to correlations of data, and so on. So if you hypothesize that there is market power in the collection of data, that a few companies will have databases that are far disproportionate to the rest of players. And if we also postulate that data and access to data is essential, then would it not follow, by the same logic of net neutrality, that there should be some access rights to that data, probably on an anonymized basis, but on some basis that there would be rights rather than access being granted? And if that's the case, it's likely that there will be, probably not starting in the United States, but in some other countries, such legislation and regulation in place. And therefore, it seems to me that for companies involved, and there's companies like Facebook or Google, the best way to deal with that obvious threat that will emerge is to have give access rights to the data, not as by way of an application that will be granted or not granted selectively, but as a blanket right to researchers and others.
I love this question because it's something I've been trying to think about a lot. And I share your concern about this trend that seems, if you look forward, it's easy to imagine tech companies that are in the business of having a big online presence, engaging with consumers in lots of different ways, search or commerce, and having this unbelievably valuable, this treasure trove of data. I've been trying to think through where that goes. And I think the tail end of your question is actually the most interesting because you posed it as the question of how data becomes available to researchers and others. Well, the others are an interesting question because in my Silicon Valley life, the interesting question was how did you get access to the data you needed to start a company? And I think that the market economics, if the trend is data repositories that are closely controlled by those who generate them, that it's easy to see that might lead to a situation with concerns about data monopolies, et cetera, that might require or might evoke regulatory responses. I've been trying to think about it from the technology lens, and the flip side of what's happening is that in fact there's an enormous amount of data that is actually publicly available. Each research community that I see is seeing the opportunity to build data commons in their area. If you think about what's happening in medicine or healthcare, you think about what's happened in astronomy. Field after field is seeing the value of putting all their data in some place where researchers and others can get access to it. I'm a little worried that we're at this point where a data commons is such a great idea that everyone has their own, and I think as soon as they start doing that, I think we're going to quickly be at a point where you really would like to have a way to look across all of that and know what data you've got, and back to all the issues of data quality and traceability. So I also can see a future where the technology trends underlying open data and data commons become an important counterweight to data monopolies generated by tech companies. And I'm very curious to see how that plays out, and I think, in fact, that there's some important technology investments that could lead to greater openness and sharing of data that I think would be critical for the ways that the conduct of research is changing, but I hope also to provide this fertile ground for entrepreneurship.
I know there's a question here, but let me ask you one follow-up question, because, I recently in China, and their 13th five-year plan strongly emphasizes the central role of innovation and creating an information society and a data-driven society and so on. And yet we know that there are limitations. It is limitations on cross-border flow of information. And there are other examples, recent case around Facebook in India, and there are many examples of different approaches being taken. And so as you look at that and think about from the impact on innovation to have what is your thinking around that? Are, big economies, so big that innovation will not be stymied if there's enough free flow of data within those jurisdictions, or needs to be bigger still in order for the...
I think that's a huge question, and I'm certainly not the expert. What I observe is that all of these ways of thinking about how to manage and control data are just a reflection of what each of these different economies and governments is all about. America has made a bet for generations now that openness and a market drive is going to win, and it's served us pretty well. I do worry about what it means in the more globalized economy, but I don't have answers. I'm sure you have people here who are much more expert than I am on that.
Question over here.
Hi, Jason Healy here from SIPA, and I loved your comments on provably secure security and the attack surface. At SIPA, we've been working with some of the banks downtown and others on a New York cyber task force for defensible cyberspace, because saying, the attackers had the advantage for decades, and so what can we do where $1 of defense buys a lot more than $1 of attack? Where you don't just spend X, you get, most of our solutions, you spend X and you get X back. But where can you spend 10X, 100X, 1,000X, and where has that worked in the past, and how can we do more of that? And we've come across so much pessimism, especially in Washington, D.C., that, we will never get defense better than offense, the defenders better than the attackers for the internet as a whole. And so I'm curious in other places where you can see where we can get that scale. where we spend X and we get 1,000X or 1,000,000X
Yeah.
back. Like Windows Update was one of those places.
Yeah,
And two,
exactly.
do you share that pessimism?
No, you need to come across the river to Arlington, Virginia, where DARPA lives rather than where policy lives. Because I think actually the technology opportunities in cybersecurity, we do think that we can see a future where we turn that corner and we start scaling solutions. You know, we're taking whole classes of vulnerabilities off the table, and we're coming up with techniques that scale faster than the attack surface grows. So I understand the pessimism, because I think there's just there's an oppressive sense that it's, you know, the problem's racing out ahead of us. But certainly at the technology level and in research, I think we can see things that are going to scale much more dramatically. Just one example, our next big grand challenge is the Cyber Grand Challenge. And you know, every network at Columbia and at DARPA, everywhere, there are people crawling over that network looking for penetrations, they're looking for vulnerabilities. It's a very manual, labor-intensive, human reasoning process. And it takes, you know, it can take a year to find a penetration or a vulnerability, and then you have to patch it. And those are, you know, the cyber warriors that DoD is training as fast and as furiously as it can to try to scale for the massive systems we have to defend. This competition essentially says, let's build machines that can reason about those kinds of network vulnerabilities. And they're not going to be very good at first, but let's build a league of their own for them to compete against each other. And like machines playing chess, they're going to be lousy at the beginning, but we think that they can get pretty good. And so we basically built, there's a Capture the Flag competition at DEF CON every year. The day before DEF CON starts in August in Las Vegas this year, we'll have a league of their own for our machines to play Capture the Flag. And to our delight, DEF CON has invited the winner of the machine competition to participate, has a seat at the table with the humans, where I think the machines are going to get whooped, actually, because they're not that good yet. But they are on a curve that I think will get them to be very capable augmentation for humans, but replicable and scalable in a way that humans aren't. And I think that's the kind of thing that gives us some hope that technology is going to catch up.
We'd love to connect with your team.
Great.
Thank you. Sir.
Thanks. Bernard Harcourt here at Columbia. So I thought, Professor Prewitt, the way you set up the conversation and historically was fascinating, but raises a question about whether or not it's possible that the future of data analytics, algorithms, et cetera, are going to be able to replicate, in some sense, the relationship to the survey world. And in part, I think that the problem is that there's an entirely different kind of epistemological motion going on today than what was going on from the 30s to, say, the 80s or a few years ago. And it's that what we're trying to do with the data today, I take it, is not so much map reality, trying to get a picture of an accurate picture, as it is that we're trying more and more to shape people's behaviors, right? And that's why there's so much push that's why the real people at the forefront are Amazon, Netflix, Google, because it's about shaping consumer behavior from the commercial perspective, getting people to watch more movies and the right ones, or the ones that they want to watch, or from a defense perspective, shaping de-radicalizing or making sure, or preventing radicalization, right? And so it's really a very different relationship to the data, and it's a different way of thinking about what we're trying to achieve. Before, it was something about getting to a true reflection of what society might have been like. Today, it's about much more shaping subjectivities. So it seems to me then that in that context, it's going to be difficult to try to replicate the relationship that the social sciences had before. Or actually, it might be the case that much of the social scientific work, which was about the correctness of the world we were trying to portray, just is no longer really in a relationship to the digital transformations and the technology that's taking place today.
That's a really powerful observation, and I'm going to dodge it in some respects because I don't have a good answer to it. I think you're right, you're very interestingly right. On the other hand, in the public sphere, there is an awful lot of interest in shaping behavior. Take your pill, practice safe sex. Read to your child when they're 1 month old, and so forth and so on. There's a lot of practices out there which, if you did them better in the society, would create a better society. So I think I want to dodge it, but by going back really to the very first question that was asked, we have to create a public good mentality around these new data. They are in the public good. They're a product of democratic behavior, and they are a contributor to a better democratic behavior, whatever vocabulary you want to use. The real problem is that this hits us, this incredible surge of new kinds of data, at a moment when we have whittled away at the idea of public authority, when every regulation is a job killer. That's why I really think DARPA is important, really important. Because DARPA sits there doing a public good, defense, after all, pretty big one, doing a public good with the capacities of a major research university. So it's a model that we don't have elsewhere. And we have got to sort of say very loudly, you need a government because you need a DARPA. And if you don't have a DARPA, we're going to lose a lot of the big battles that are out there. So I just want to say, let's talk, I don't mean not now, but just generally, we have to appreciate that we've shrunken the idea of public authority and of public good in service of all these marvelous new toys and gadgets and so forth we're getting out of the private sector. We all love them and we carry them and so forth and so on. But we've got to get that balance back. And I think that's part of what's going on in this campaign right now, as a matter of fact, in a kind of distorted way, but it's going on. But I also want to just come back to why I would argue that DARPA is a really key institution in carrying this message.
I join that admiration for DARPA in part because, it's not trying to solve all problems in-house. It's creating massive partnerships and driving innovation through partnerships, which I think is an amazing model. Your example really speaks a lot to the commercial entities, and I suppose interesting, Arati was also mentioning kind of innovations in biomedical areas where, some of that great data that's being created has access issues, privacy access issues, but is not being, pushed for commercial purpose, but we need to be able to use it to derive the insights necessary for some of this, for example, in biomedical. And I wonder if you just say a concluding word about that area, which seems to be fairly new for DARPA.
Well, I mean, I think that what's going on with data and healthcare records and genetic information is a vast set of activities that are happening. DARPA recently started a biological technologies office scooping up the things we were doing in different parts of the agency because of this intersection of biology with information technology and data and physical sciences and engineering. That's the kind of place where there's so much research activity and people are running around with their hair on fire in their labs and at conferences. And those are the signals that tell us that technology surprise is going to happen, and we want to be there and help drive that and shape that. So the areas in which we're investing there range from synthetic biology to work that's focused on trying to nip infectious disease in the bud. Can we, instead of developing a vaccine after the H1N1 wave has swept through the country and infected 60 million people, can we actually get population immunity on the front end of that bulge? We're working on neurotechnologies, we started with the issues of restoring function for our wounded war fighters, of course, but of course in that work you also start to to learn amazing things about the human brain. And maybe a good place to end that story is simply to say that one of the most delightful things I learned recently, if you think about these machine learning systems, really what they are is a very crude and rudimentary emulation of the brain, where you have nodes and weights between them, and as these electronic systems learn, the weights adapt, somewhat in analogy to how our brains adapt and learn. And I recently learned that in our neurotechnology work, when we're reading electrical signaling from the human brain using these small electrode arrays to restore motor function or to understand injury, the way our systems learn how to look at the pulse train that comes off of those electrodes is through machine learning. And I just thought that was a marvelous use of data in understanding the brain. So.
Well, fantastic. I see a bundle of policy issues that might emanate.
The list is endless, exactly.
From that, and I think we have a rich agenda ahead of us. But this is a marvelous start to the day. I feel we could keep going for many hours, but unfortunately we must pause and turn to the rest of the agenda. But please join me in thanking Arati for being with us today.
Thank you very much.